What if I told you that some of the healthy foods you eat every day are silently blocking your fat loss? You're eating clean, you're trying to lose weight, but the scale won't move. Here's the truth most people miss. It's not just calories, it's not just carbs, it's your insulin response. And today, you'll learn exactly which healthy foods spike insulin and how to fix it. You think fat loss is about discipline, cutting calories, or finding the perfect diet, but there is a hidden biological switch inside your body that quietly decides whether you burn fat or store it every single minute of the day. And that switch is called insulin, a hormone so powerful that researchers from metabolic science and endocrinology have repeatedly shown it doesn't just respond to food, it actively controls whether your body has access to its own fat stores, meaning that even before you finish your meal, your metabolism has already made a decision about your next few hours and possibly your next few weeks. When you eat carbohydrates or even certain protein-rich foods, your pancreas releases insulin into your bloodstream, and this hormone acts like a storage key, unlocking your cells so glucose can enter for energy. But here's the part most people never hear in mainstream health advice. Insulin does not just help process sugar, it actively shuts down fat burning at the cellular level. Because when insulin is high, your body receives a clear survival message that fuel is abundant and there is no need to access stored fat. So instead of breaking fat down, your body stores incoming energy and pauses lipolysis, the process where fat cells release fatty acids to be burned. And this is not theory, this is well-established physiology documented in metabolic research for decades. Now imagine this happening not occasionally, but repeatedly throughout your day every time you eat what you believe is a healthy meal. Because foods like oatmeal, whole grain bread, fruit juices, smoothies, and even low-fat flavored yogurts can trigger a surprisingly strong insulin response, especially in people with insulin resistance, which according to large-scale metabolic studies affects a significant portion of adults worldwide, often without them even knowing it. And this is where the trap begins, because you may be eating clean, you may be avoiding junk food, but if insulin is constantly elevated, your body never receives the signal to switch into fat-burning mode. Scientific studies on postprandial insulin response show that blood sugar and insulin spikes are not only determined by whether a food is natural or processed, but by how quickly it is digested and absorbed, which is why liquid carbohydrates like fruit juices or blended smoothies can behave metabolically closer to sugar water than whole food. And this rapid absorption triggers a sharp insulin surge that temporarily suppresses fat oxidation, meaning your body is essentially locked out of its fat stores for hours after consumption. And when this pattern repeats across breakfast, lunch, snacks, and dinner, your metabolism becomes chronically biased towards storage rather than burning. Even more concerning is what happens in the background when insulin is frequently elevated, because research in endocrinology has shown that persistently high insulin levels can reduce insulin sensitivity over time, creating a feedback loop where the body requires even more insulin to manage the same amount of glucose. And this condition, known as insulin resistance, is strongly associated with difficulty losing weight, increased abdominal fat storage, and metabolic inflexibility, meaning the body loses its ability to easily switch between burning glucose and burning fat, which is one of the key markers of metabolic health. This is why two people can eat the same number of calories and get completely different results, because one person may be cycling between low and high insulin states, allowing periods of fat burning between meals, while another person is constantly spiking insulin through frequent, healthy eating, snacks, and high-carb meals, never giving the body a window to access stored fat. And over time, this creates a frustrating paradox where someone is doing everything right according to conventional advice, yet their body remains stuck in storage mode. And what makes this even more deceptive is how the food industry has labeled certain foods as healthy, because terms like whole grain, low fat, or natural do not necessarily reflect metabolic impact, and multiple nutritional studies have shown that the glycemic and insulin response to foods can vary dramatically between individuals, meaning what is considered a healthy breakfast for one person may trigger a significant insulin spike in another, especially in those already metabolically compromised. At the cellular level, insulin binds to receptors that signal fat cells to stop releasing stored energy and simultaneously encourages the liver to convert excess glucose into glycogen and fat, a process known as lipogenesis. And while this is a normal survival mechanism designed to store energy during times of abundance, in today's environment of constant food availability, it becomes a chronic state rather than an occasional response, effectively keeping many people in a perpetual cycle of energy storage. What is truly shocking is that even protein, which is essential for muscle repair and health, can stimulate insulin release, although in a different pattern than carbohydrates, which is why timing and food combinations matter more than most people realize, because a meal that combines rapidly digestible carbohydrates with minimal fiber, fat, or protein buffering effect can cause a much sharper insulin response than a balanced meal designed to slow absorption and stabilize blood sugar. This is not about demonizing food, and it is not about fear, but about understanding a fundamental biological truth. Insulin is not just a blood sugar regulator. It is the master switch that determines whether your body is in fat storage mode or fat burning mode. And once you understand this mechanism, you begin to see why so many traditional diets fail long term, because they focus only on calories while ignoring hormonal response, even though hormones ultimately control energy partitioning in the body. The most important realization from decades of metabolic research is that fat loss is not simply about eating less, but about creating conditions where insulin remains low enough, long enough, for the body to access stored energy. And this is why strategies like reducing refined carbohydrates, avoiding frequent snacking, and prioritizing whole, minimally processed foods have been consistently associated in studies with improved metabolic markers and easier weight management, not because these foods are magical, but because they reduce the frequency of insulin spikes. And when insulin finally drops, something powerful happens inside the body because fat cells open up, stored triglycerides are broken down into usable fuel, and the body shifts into a state of metabolic flexibility where it can efficiently burn its own energy reserves. But this state cannot occur if insulin is constantly being triggered again and again throughout the day, which is why timing, food composition, and eating patterns matter just as much as food quality itself. So when we talk about fat loss being blocked, it is not an emotional or motivational failure. It is often a biological signal issue where the body is simply responding correctly to repeated insulin spikes by storing energy and protecting itself from perceived abundance. And once this is understood, the entire narrative around weight loss changes from frustration and self-blame to strategy and metabolic control, because you are no longer fighting your body. You are learning how to communicate with it through food and timing. You've been told a comforting story your whole life. If a food is healthy, it automatically supports fat loss, but the human metabolism does not read labels. It responds to chemistry, hormones, and survival signals. And when you start looking at the body through the lens of endocrinology rather than marketing, a surprising truth begins to emerge that even some of the most clean and wholesome foods can send a powerful insulin signal that temporarily shuts down fat burning. And this is not speculation. It is grounded in decades of metabolic research showing that insulin response is driven primarily by how the body processes nutrients, not by how natural or aesthetic the food appears on the plate. Take something like oatmeal, often promoted as a heart-healthy breakfast and even recommended in clinical nutrition guidelines, and yet when you consume it, especially in refined or quick-cooking forms, your digestive system rapidly breaks down its starch into glucose, which enters the bloodstream and triggers the pancreas to release insulin. And while oats do contain fiber and micronutrients, studies on glycemic response show that many individuals still experience a significant rise in blood sugar and insulin after eating them, particularly when eaten alone without fat or protein to slow absorption. And what that means biologically is simple but powerful. Your body shifts out of fat burning mode and into glucose handling mode because insulin is now signaling that energy is available and must be stored or used immediately. Now, extend that same mechanism to whole wheat bread, another food widely marketed as a healthier alternative to white bread, yet metabolically, whole grains can still produce a meaningful insulin response, especially in people with underlying insulin resistance, and research in nutritional science has shown that the whole grain halo effect often leads people to overconsume these foods while assuming they are metabolically neutral. But in reality, the starch content is still converted into glucose, and insulin rises accordingly, which means that even though the food may contain more fiber and nutrients, it can still interrupt fat oxidation for hours after consumption, keeping the body in a state where stored fat is not the primary fuel source. Then there are fruit juices and smoothies, perhaps one of the most misunderstood categories in modern nutrition, because the moment you remove fiber from fruit, you fundamentally change how the body processes it. And clinical studies comparing whole fruit versus juice consistently show that liquid carbohydrates are absorbed significantly faster, leading to sharper spikes in blood glucose and insulin. And this is why a glass of orange juice does not behave metabolically like eating an orange, because the fiber matrix that slows digestion has been removed, and the liver is suddenly flooded with fructose and glucose that must be processed quickly, triggering insulin release and temporarily suppressing fat breakdown in the process. Even smoothies, often seen as the pinnacle of health-conscious eating, can create a similar effect depending on their composition, because blending breaks down cellular structure and reduces chewing, which further accelerates digestion. And when you combine fruits, oats, honey, or yogurt into a single liquid meal, you are essentially creating a rapidly absorbable carbohydrate load that can produce a surprisingly strong insulin response, especially in individuals with metabolic dysfunction. And this is why some people who switch to smoothies for clean eating sometimes find that their hunger increases rather than decreases, because insulin fluctuations directly influence hunger hormones like ghrelin and leptin, which regulate appetite and satiety. Low-fat yogurt presents another paradox that modern nutritional science has been forced to confront, because when fat is removed from dairy products, taste often has to be compensated for with added sugars or sweeteners, and even without added sugar, dairy proteins such as whey are among the most insulinogenic natural proteins known, meaning they can stimulate insulin release even in the absence of high carbohydrate intake, a fact documented in metabolic research where protein-rich dairy products were shown to elevate insulin disproportionately compared to their glucose impact. And while this does not make yogurt inherently bad, it does mean that frequent consumption of flavored or low-fat versions can contribute to repeated insulin elevation throughout the day, especially when combined with other carbohydrate sources. Rice, particularly white rice, but even brown rice in some cases, is another staple food that illustrates the complexity of insulin response. Because while rice is a traditional dietary cornerstone in many cultures and provides a readily available energy source, it is also rapidly digested starch, and numerous glycemic index studies have shown that rice can produce a significant post-meal blood glucose rise, which then triggers insulin release to shuttle that glucose into cells. And when this pattern repeats across multiple meals, the body spends extended periods in a non-fat burning state because insulin suppresses lipolysis until blood glucose levels stabilize and insulin falls again. And then there are protein bars and fitness snacks, which may be one of the most deceptive categories of modern food marketing because they are often designed to appear healthy, packed with protein claims, fiber labels, and fitness branding, yet many contain hidden sugars, sugar alcohols, or highly processed carbohydrate blends such as maltodextrin, which has a glycemic impact comparable to glucose. And when these ingredients are consumed, they can provoke a rapid insulin response that contradicts the perceived health value of the product, creating a false sense of metabolic safety while still driving insulin cycles that interfere with fat oxidation. What ties all of these foods together is not that they are inherently toxic or dangerous, but that they share a common metabolic property. They are capable of raising insulin, sometimes moderately and sometimes significantly, and insulin, once elevated, acts as a master regulator that prioritizes storage over burning, meaning that even if you are eating in a calorie deficit, frequent insulin spikes can reduce the time your body spends in fat burning mode, which is one of the reasons why people often report stalled progress despite eating clean. Scientific literature in endocrinology has repeatedly confirmed that insulin is a primary regulator of lipolysis. And when insulin levels remain elevated throughout the day due to frequent meals, snacks, or high carbohydrate food choices, the body has fewer opportunities to access stored triglycerides for energy, which can lead to a metabolic environment where energy is constantly being cycled in and out, but rarely drawn from fat reserves. And over time, this can reinforce a pattern of weight loss resistance that feels confusing and frustrating from the outside, but is actually a predictable hormonal response from within. And perhaps the most important realization is that the human body is not designed to be in a constant fed state. Because from an evolutionary perspective, insulin spikes were meant to be occasional signals following periods of food intake, not continuous background noise throughout the entire day. And when modern eating patterns create repeated insulin elevations through breakfast, snacks, lunch, drinks, desserts, and late night food, the metabolic system is essentially locked in a perpetual storage mode, never fully transitioning into fat utilization. Understanding this does not mean eliminating all carbohydrate-containing foods or fearing nutrition, but it does mean recognizing that metabolic health is not just about what you eat, but how often you trigger hormonal responses. And once you see food through this lens, you begin to understand why timing, composition, and frequency of meals can be just as important as food quality itself, because every eating event is also a hormonal event, and insulin is always listening. What if the biggest reason you're not losing fat isn't your diet, isn't your workout, and isn't even your calories, but something happening silently inside your body every time you eat? Something so powerful that it can shut down fat burning within minutes and keep it switched off for hours. And science has a name for this control system: insulin regulation, the master metabolic switch that determines whether your body burns stored fat or locks it away. And once you understand this, you realize fat loss is not a mystery of willpower. It is a predictable hormonal outcome that can be influenced with precision if you understand how to stop repeatedly interrupting your fat burning state. At a biological level, insulin is not just a blood sugar hormone, it is a storage signal. And when it rises, your body interprets it as a message that energy is abundant, which immediately suppresses lipolysis, the process where fat cells release fatty acids to be used as fuel. And this has been demonstrated in metabolic studies for decades, showing that even small but frequent elevations in insulin can significantly reduce fat oxidation throughout the day, meaning your body may technically be fed, but metabolically trapped in storage mode, unable to efficiently access its own fat reserves. Now, here is where most people unknowingly sabotage themselves. They don't just eat once or twice a day, they trigger insulin repeatedly, sometimes every few hours, with snacks, drinks, small bites, healthy bars, or even light meals that seem harmless. But each of these eating events reactivates insulin. And insulin does not politely fade away instantly. It lingers in the bloodstream, continuing to suppress fat burning while your body waits for it to drop before it can switch into fat oxidation mode again. And this means that frequent eating patterns can create a near continuous insulin environment where fat burning windows barely open at all. Scientific research on meal frequency and metabolic flexibility has shown that the body requires periods of low insulin in order to fully activate fat metabolism pathways, including increased mitochondrial fatty acid oxidation. But when insulin is repeatedly stimulated, the body spends less time in that low insulin state, effectively reducing metabolic flexibility, which is the ability to switch efficiently between glucose and fat as fuel. And loss of this flexibility is strongly associated in clinical literature with weight gain, abdominal fat accumulation, and difficulty losing weight even when calorie intake appears controlled. Think about what that means in real life. You wake up, maybe eat oatmeal or toast, insulin rises, fat burning pauses. A few hours later, you snack, insulin rises again, fat burning pauses again. Lunch comes, another spike, maybe a healthy snack in the afternoon, another interruption, dinner, another rise, and possibly even a late night bite, which is one of the most metabolically disruptive habits because insulin elevation at night interferes with overnight fat oxidation, a period when the body is normally designed to shift into repair and fat utilization mode, according to circadian rhythm research in metabolism. And this is not just theoretical physiology, because studies on intermittent fasting and time restricted eating have repeatedly shown improvements in insulin sensitivity and fat oxidation simply by reducing the frequency of insulin spikes, not necessarily by changing food quality alone, which means the timing of eating can be as influential as the food itself in determining metabolic outcomes, a concept that challenges the traditional belief that calories are all that matters. Because hormonally, calories consumed in a constantly insulin-activated state do not behave the same way as calories consumed in a low insulin fat-burning environment. Even more striking is what happens inside fat cells during repeated insulin exposure, because insulin not only stops fat breakdown, it actively promotes fat storage by increasing lipoprotein lipase activity in adipose tissue, which helps pull circulating fatty acids into fat cells, meaning that every insulin spike is not just pausing fat loss, it can also enhance fat storage efficiency, a mechanism clearly described in biochemical research on lipid metabolism. And this creates a metabolic environment where the body becomes extremely efficient at storing energy while becoming increasingly inefficient at releasing it. Over time, this pattern can contribute to insulin resistance, a condition where cells become less responsive to insulin signal, forcing the pancreas to produce more of it to achieve the same effect, and large epidemiological studies have linked chronic hyperinsulinemia with increased risk of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome. But what is often not emphasized is that insulin resistance does not appear suddenly. It builds gradually through repeated metabolic stimulation, often years before blood sugar levels become abnormal, which means many people are already in a dysfunctional insulin state long before they are diagnosed with any disease. This is why two people can eat similar foods and have completely different outcomes, because one person may have better insulin sensitivity and more stable metabolic responses, while another person experiences exaggerated insulin spikes and prolonged suppression of fat burning, even from the same meal. And this variability is well documented in nutritional research, showing that individual insulin responses to identical foods can differ significantly based on genetics, body composition, activity levels, and existing metabolic health. And here is the critical insight most people never hear. Fat loss does not primarily happen when insulin is high. It happens when insulin is low because low insulin allows hormone-sensitive lipase to activate, releasing stored fatty acids from adipose tissue so they can be transported and burned for energy. And this is the state your body naturally enters between meals, during sleep, and during extended periods without food. But if those windows are constantly interrupted, your body rarely gets the opportunity to fully activate fat-burning pathways. This is why structured eating patterns that create intentional gaps between meals can have such a profound effect on metabolic health, not because they are magical or extreme, but because they simply allow insulin levels to fall long enough for fat oxidation to resume. And once this process is restored, many people report not just weight changes, but also reduced cravings, improved energy stability, and better appetite regulation, which aligns with research on insulin's influence on hunger hormones like leptin and ghrelin. And perhaps the most important truth is this: your body is always responding correctly to the signals you give it. And if insulin is repeatedly telling your system that energy is available, your metabolism will respond by storing rather than burning, not out of failure, but out of survival logic that has been hardwired into human biology for millions of years. Because in an evolutionary environment, frequent insulin spikes would have indicated food abundance, and storage would have been the safest response. But in today's world, that same survival system can be constantly activated by modern eating patterns, even when food is not scarce, creating a mismatch between biology and behavior that quietly drives weight gain and metabolic dysfunction. And once you understand this mismatch, fat loss stops being about punishment or restriction and becomes about timing, rhythm, and giving your body permission to enter the state it was always designed for: low insulin, high fat oxidation, and efficient energy use from stored fuel.